Okay, so we know now glyphosate's poison. How much of it is the average person taking in? And then how little, obviously you don't want to take any in, it's a poison, but how little starts to cause problems?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's toxic at very low levels, and there have been studies, for example, on mice, rats exposed to glyphosate at low doses, well below regulatory limits, showing a development of fatty liver disease, even with those very low doses. And I mentioned the Seralini study that got retracted. It got republished, by the way, so it's still valid in a different journal. And that study was really seminal, and that was what persuaded me, as I said, to keep going with the glyphosate. Basically repeated an experiment that the industry had done. He copied their whole strategy with rats in the control group and all the treated groups and the number of rats and the particular kind of rats. He copied what they had done. They looked for 3 months, and they had a declaration that if you don't see any trouble after 3 months, you're good to go with animal studies. You only need to look for 3 months. So they looked for 3 months, everything was fine. They said doesn't cause problems. Well, Seralini kept it going after 3 months and went all the way to their whole lifespan. And he started seeing problems at 4 months. And by the end of the experiment, there were massive problems. The females had massive mammary tumors. There was kidney damage, liver damage, reproductive issues, early death, all kinds of problems with the exposure long term. So it's a slow kill, is an important point. It's a slow kill, and it also can be damaging at very low levels. And the regulatory limits are not adequate. So it's all over the food supply, and this is something my friend Zen Honeycutt has been showing us. As I said, the government doesn't bother to test it. I think they've only tested it on soy 1 year, and I think it was in 2012, and they found it in like over 90% of the soy samples. So it's it's just like it's all over the soy, which is not surprising because soy is a GMO Roundup Ready crop. Um, but Zen Honeycutt has moms across America. She has this organization that she recruits moms to help her out, and the moms can collect samples. So the moms collected samples of the school lunches, the kids at the cafeteria, and sent them off for testing. And they found glyphosate in like 95% of the samples of the school lunch samples. And then she did another study on fast food restaurants. And again, that time it was 100% of the samples were contaminated with glyphosate. So it is like all over the food supply. And it's not just the GMO. You think, oh, non-GMO, great, I'll buy that. That's not good because some of the highest levels are showing up in non-GMO products derived from, there's a bunch of crops that are sprayed right before harvest. And it's used as a desiccant to kill the crop, sorry. Used as a desiccant. And, um, and those crops include wheat, oats, uh, chickpeas, garbanzo beans, lentils, barley. So it's basically grains and beans, legumes, and also sugarcane. So all these crops are sprayed right before harvest, and that's really bad because it's very close to the harvest, so it hasn't gone away. It gets into the seed, and it's actually there's high levels in wheat germ, for example, because it tends to go into the seed as the crop dies. So they're killing the crop because they're ready to harvest, and in dying, it goes to seed, and it synchronizes the yield and increases the amount of food you can get out of that crop by virtue of doing that desiccation process, and also gets a head start on next year's weeds, right? Because you've already hit the ground with the weed killer to try to keep the weeds out. So the farmers think it's a great idea to do this, and of course they don't realize that it's toxic. But I think it's a huge. If we could just get rid of glyphosate used as a desiccant, I think we would be a lot better off as far as we would get a reduced burden in our food if we did that.
And I've even heard you say that it's worse in these crops that are non-GMO.
Yeah, it's higher levels, in those foods, and that's very dangerous because they can be labeled as non-GMO, and you can think you're buying something that's good, but you're not. And that's how of course, why I think it's very clear to me, and I can't believe it's not clear to everybody, that glyphosate is a major factor in gluten intolerance. We have such an epidemic. For most of my life, I was not aware of that there could be such a thing as gluten intolerance. It was that rare. I didn't know about it until I started seeing these gluten-free foods at the grocery store. That's what first tipped me off, and maybe there's something going on here. And then I thought, well, wheat, I said, well, wheat's not a GMO crop. That's really weird. I immediately suspected glyphosate, but I couldn't justify it. And then, of course, I looked and saw, my God, it's being sprayed right before harvest. That convinced, and I have a paper. One of my papers is on that gluten intolerance, linking it to glyphosate. I feel confident, very confident, that glyphosate is the primary cause of gluten intolerance.
Let's take a step back and talk about the history here. Who created glyphosate? When was this? I know the initial use was intended at something else and they've pivoted that, and then we'll work our way back to modern day.
Yeah, okay, yes, great. They originally they discovered it was a good because it's a metal chelator. They thought we can use this as a pipe cleaner, and so the idea was to, and they patented it to be used to strip metals off of pipes because it's very good at chelating metals. I think it was an accidental discovery that it killed plants that led to the breakthrough. That then they thought, oh, maybe we can use this as an herbicide. And then they patented it as an herbicide, and then they marketed it. 1974, I think, was when it first was available in the United States. So it goes back many, many decades. 1974. Its use didn't get ramped up until the GMO crops were introduced around the turn of the century. So, and then once they started using it for the GMO, then they created these GMO crops that had a microbial enzyme inserted into the genome that was resistant, that produced a version of this enzyme, EPSP synthase, that was resistant to glyphosate. And so this was great because it caused the plant to be able to survive and even thrive, even though it's being exposed to glyphosate. So you could just spray the glyphosate all over the crop, kill off the weeds, and leave the crop behind. It became a very efficient way to grow crops. And so the farmers really, really grabbed onto that. And the amount of GMO versions of these core crops went up dramatically over the first decade of this century. Soy, corn, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, those are the main ones. And, um, and then those crops became the core of the processed food industry, and which means that it's higher, this tends to be higher levels of glyphosate in processed foods for that reason.
And the reason that it basically gets a free pass is because plants have this shikimate pathway that
Right.
humans don't have. So it's given this pass of safety. But the oversight here is that our microbiome, the microbes have this pathway.
Yes,
So
they have the
talk more to
pathway,
that
and
oversight.
that's a very good point because they use the pathway to produce products that our cells can't make. I mean, they don't have a pathway, they can't make the product, and those products are super important to the host. And in fact, key molecules that come out of the shikimate pathway. So the shikimate pathway is this whole pathway, and EPSB synthase is a particular enzyme in the pathway. We don't have the whole pathway. We don't have the enzyme in our cells, and that's the argument. It's a pretty strong argument. It's attractive, right, to say, oh, great, we're not affected. But our microbes not only have that pathway, but they use that pathway to produce essential nutrients for the host, and in particular, the aromatic amino acids. And that's tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. And those are really, really important molecules for us. First of all, they're part of the coding amino acids that go into all the proteins, with the DNA code. So they're essential for making proteins. But more than that, they're precursors to all kinds of really powerful molecules in the body, namely all the neurotransmitters like serotonin, melatonin, epinephrine, dopamine, thyroid hormone, melanin, the skin tanning agent. I mean, all of those come out of the shikimate pathway. So if the microbes are not able to make enough of these critical amino acids, then all those things become deficient, and you get really big trouble with your whole hormone system. It becomes disrupted.
What about the GMO aspect?
The GMO
The fact
itself.
that we're taking genetics from bacteria and we're putting those within the crops. So, glyphosate aside, do you see that as being a problem in and of itself?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there were people who were concerned about the GMOs long ago, before they were aware of any problems with glyphosate, because of the actual GMO technology to actually have that foreign protein in that plant, or even the process that puts that foreign protein into the plant. What else does it do to the genome, and how can that affect us? And I think there are still open questions on all of that. The GMO that there's a GMO that produces an insecticide. It gives the animals, I mean the plants, a gene from from a microbe that produces an insecticide with with that protein, and so that means that the plant produces that same pesticide, and produces this toxic um, pesticide using the gene that it borrowed from the microbe. So I mean, they're amazing with their ability to create these monster designs that are way outside of nature. And then you have the CRISPR technology as well that's rolling out. And they're trying to claim CRISPR is not GMO. They're trying to get the government to decide that CRISPR doesn't need to be labeled as a GMO technology. And CRISPR is supposed to be very crisp, and very perfect, but it's not true because it's all kinds of other things that happen unexpected, and they're finding that out in research that they're doing, that it not only does the specific, it's supposed to be able to do a specific gene editing. It's quite remarkable what CRISPR can do. And they have a lot of hope for CRISPR even to correct human errors. If you have a genetic defect that's causing a really serious problem, in theory, you could use CRISPR to fix that in an embryo, for example. I mean, it's just pretty amazing some of the things that you might think of doing. But the CRISPR is not precise, and it turns out it causes all kinds of other genetic changes in random ways that is completely unpredictable as far as what the consequences might be. The GMOs, it's interesting because I was shocked to find this out. When they rolled out the GMO technology, they did experiments to see if those plants were safe. They grew the GMO plants that, for example, with a glyphosate resistance, and they grew them organically. They didn't put any glyphosate on them. And then they tested to see if they were safe to eat. So they left out a really important part of the GMO, which was the fact that you could use the glyphosate was going to show up in the product. They just left the glyphosate part out when they did the study. So they do a lot of cheating, I think, when they studied glyphosate to get it to be approved. They left out all the other stuff that's in Roundup because you have a lot of different adjuvants and surfactants that are added to the product to make the glyphosate more toxic, better able to be taken up by the plant cells. Also, those things are also independently toxic. So there have been people who've written articles that claim that the other stuff in Roundup is more toxic than the glyphosate.
Not to mention the interaction of
Certainly,
all of it together.
exactly. It makes the glyphosate more toxic, and it's also toxic in and of itself. And so that's a whole other issue that when they studied glyphosate exposure in animal studies or in cultures, they didn't put those other things in there. They just used the pure glyphosate.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
A lot of people don't know what glyphosate is, and I admit I didn't know what it was either back in 2010, 2011. They patented it to be used to strip metals off of pipes because it's very good at chelating metals. I think it was an accidental discovery.